All right, y'all. So now we've just got done talking about Southeast Asia, and now we're going to go to South Asia. South Asia, we already know a little bit about South Asia. We do know that, when we look at here, we see Goa. We already know that Albuquerque established that area as a really kind of a quasi permanent part of the Portuguese Empire. And even as they decline, they're going to be able to maintain that. But the rest of the Mughal Empire became opened to European invasion. And really, it's less about the Portuguese did and really about the Mughal Empire. So, very quickly, if you don't know, the Mughal Empire was established when a group that derived from the Mongols invaded, and they invaded it from this direction. The Mughals were Mongols who had converted to Islam, and they're going to utilize their power, their military strength, to dominate northern uh, India. And they're going to be able to do this quite readily with their might. And the Mughal Empire, unfortunately for them, despite being so powerful, the Mughals emerged as a power vacuum. And before I get there, I want to emphasize the Mughal Empire brought Islam into India. I'm going to repeat that. Mughal Empire brought Islam into the empire. And it emerged as a power vacuum for two reasons. Number one, politically, there was political divisions. Rajas or local princes controlled the localities. So the Mughal Empire is similar to the Holy Roman Empire. Yes, there is an empire. Yes, there is an emperor. But in the end, the Rajas or local princes have significant power, and those Rajas are going to be very competitive. That political competition is going to be exploited by the French, Dutch, and English. And of course, the religious divisions. The Hindu majority resisted Islamic rule. They did not enjoy being dominated by Muslims. And from what I understand, I believe the Muslims made up less than 20% of the overall population during this time period. So the majority Hindu was really they were divided in different reasons, but they were consistently religiously divided. So once again, it's gonna the European intruders, they're going to play on the political and religious divisions. With the vast amount of wealth, the European states sought to exploit these divisions. And despite the Dutch making inroads here early on, they're going to really withdraw. The Dutch are only going to be able to maintain the southern part with Ceylon and this other area. It looks like Calicut. But again, they're not going to play really any significant role. It's really going to be the Anglo-French rivalry. As the Portuguese declined, the English and French competed over dominance. You can see in this map the different colonies the British company forged. And I do want to point out the British East India Company. They were the English colonial machine. The British East India Company had gained a charter from the king that they would be able to dominate all of the Asian trade. They had a monopoly. We're going to cover that a little bit more with the commercial revolution. So the British East India Company were highly motivated to utilize their capital to militarily develop and dominate their colonies. The British East India Company originally is not going to really rely on the British military might because they are an independent entity. And we see that early on, they were able to really create a series of trade colonies here. We see Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta. But the French monarch, who began to see the need to expand, this is really going to be attached to mercantilism. And we're going to see this later with our last lecture. But mercantilism is the idea that France needed resources, they needed wealth, they needed to expand to gain a self-sufficient economy. He ordered people like Colbert to really branch out and send the French into these areas as well. And they may have gotten there a little late. As you see, they only have one colony there. But in the end, by 1750, the growing rivalry was on the brink of an imperial war in India. The local leaders had a tendency to support the French because the French were not really here to dominate in some ways. At least they felt that way. Whereas the British were really seeking to create a permanence here because the British East India Company were focused on developing significant amounts of infrastructure. And this rivalry is going to break into the 7 Years' War. 7 Years' War, the French are going to gain some early victories as they were able to forge alliances with Indian princes, especially the Bengali princes. Bengali princes are north of the Bay of Bengal. And the French were able to have these striking victories. They had the full weight of the French military on their side. So they were able to outmaneuver with alliances the British. The French monarchy did limit resources, though. He was not heavily engaged with this because he feared that France would be overextended because he also had colonies concerned in Canada. And this is one of the significance when we look at the development maybe of capitalism, how the British had really delegated imperial building to their merchants. The French did not do that. The French were not, and that's going to be a little significant later, but right now, this is the problem of French absolutism. The French monarch is attempting to do far too much and is not delegated to this group of merchants. And despite them having these early victories, the British East India Company is going to realize they have limited resources and they're going to need to exploit British nationalism. And what happens here? Well, the turning point is going to be the Black Hole of Calcutta. As a historian, I do think the Black Hole of Calcutta in itself is really an insignificant event by itself. There's a Bengali Raja who imprisoned nearly 150 citizens in a small prison overnight. Dozens had died. It seemed like the Raja may have not realized exactly the situation, and once he realized the brutal situation, he immediately made some changes. But it was dozens had died. Uh, but it's the actual events irrelevant. It's what Sir Robert Clive did to it that really changed the nature of this war. Robert Clive used this event to he sent it to the British newspapers, British magazines, and he turns it into a propaganda machine. And now all of a sudden, this black hole of Calcutta, it was reported that 143 people suffocated, and that the British, this is an attack not just on the British people there, but Great Britain overall. And this really created a emotional movement in which British Parliament, playing on that wave of nationalism, they decided to declare war and they got actively involved and supported Sir Robert Clive. And here we're going to see the military. And once the British Army gets more fully engaged here, it appears that it offset the balance of powers here. Despite the French having key alliances, it really is going to lead to this smashing wave of victories that peak really with the Battle of Plassey. Even despite this war continuing to go on after this, it seems as if the Battle of Plassey was the definitive moment in which the British East India Company really demonstrated their strength. This is despite the Indian Army being significantly larger, the British, with their superior discipline and superior military technology, defeated them. And at the result of this battle, it appeared that the British East India Company gained the power to tax Indians in areas it controlled. This is a really significant element. I remember when I read Spivogel 2 decades ago for the first time, this jumped out at me because taxes are an act of governing. It is not something a merchants do. Merchants actually resist taxes in many ways. But the British East India Company becomes the de facto government because now they're going to use the power to tax that it gained here to really become the sovereign or the acting government. And in the end, I want to point out before we move on here, this is the Mughal Empire clearly is losing its sovereignty. And they're not losing the sovereignty to Britain. They're losing their sovereignty to the British East India Company, a handful of British merchants who are attempting to create profit for their company are now going to govern parts of India, and really significant. By 1763, the war is over with. The Peace of Paris, or the Treaty of Paris of 1763, really established a British stronghold. The French are really basically forced out. They might be able to hold on to something here, but in the end, the French play no significant role in Indian colonization. The British East India Company gains significant political power. Remember, they have power to tax, and they become the de facto government over certain regions, and they're going to dominate parts of India from 1763 all the way to 1857. Not These are not necessarily the only year I need you to memorize is this year, Peace of Paris. It brings it in to our unit time wise. But I want to point out that for the next almost 100 years, the British East India Company will be the acting government over many of these areas in which they're really gonna overexploit the resources, overexploit labor, and again, it's a relatively shocking moment in world history. But with that said, I'm gonna pause here.